Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation on writing about experiences for health professions. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye, the Director of Advising and Programs at Beyond Barnard and Health Professions Advisor. I'm excited to talk to you all today about what I think is really like one of the core elements of the application. So let's dive right in. My goals for this session are for us to think about the importance of the experiences section of your application. In some applications, it's called experiences. In AMCAS, the MD's program application, it's called work and activities. But there are some sort of structural similarities across all of these application services as to what opportunity you're going to have. So we'll talk about why this section is important, why it's something to focus on. We'll talk about my tips for presenting yourself and your experiences in the best ways possible, the most accessible ways to the reader of your application. And hopefully we'll get a little bit of time for you all to read some samples and to think through some evaluation of those example entries. So fairly simple agenda as always. We'll talk a little bit about, getting started and sort of the lay of the land. We'll talk about how I recommend beginning with a structure to write about these experiences. We'll talk through some examples, and then I'll wrap it up with a few kind of final reminders. So, first things first, just so everyone is on the same page, when we're talking about an experiences or work and activity section, what I'm talking about is that in centralized application services used by health professions programs, typically they are not going to ask you to upload a document like a resume or a CV. Instead, they're going to give you a section in the application that allows you to present information that you might otherwise present on a resume or CV with a little bit of a twist. So number one, you're going to have a sort of structured way of presenting start and end dates and title of experience, et cetera, et cetera. You're also going to have a set amount of characters to provide some prose about the experience. In AMCAS, that's 700 characters. In a lot of the other application systems, it's 600. So it's not a lot of space. It's a short paragraph, essentially. In some application services, you also have the ability to designate some activities as most meaningful, which gives you some additional character space to write more about those. I'll talk more about that later. Some of these application services don't actually limit the number of experiences you can include. AMCAS does, and it provides space for you to list up to 15 activities. Every application service has its own set of kind of categories for you to use to describe your experiences. You can choose one category per entry typically, and every application service has its own list. Some of them are a lot longer than others. As we're talking about the, sort of, post these logistics, thinking about, what are we actually trying to accomplish here in this section, I want to ask you to keep an overarching question in mind. You've all been working on your applications for a long time. You've been building up a portfolio of experiences. And now you're at the stage where you're going to have to communicate those experiences to readers, right? Who have not had your experiences, who don't know you. And I want you to keep in the back of your mind as I'm talking through all of the rest of this presentation, what is the difference between doing something, having an experience, and then communicating the meaning of that experience in writing in your application? There is a difference, and one is not really useful without the other. So that's really what I want us to be thinking about this evening. How do you move from having had an experience to being able to describe for a reader why that experience is relevant for them to know, and how it has helped you to grow in your pre-professional identity? I think this is important because professional programs want to know how you have spent your time, right? They're going to be obviously looking at your academic history, but they also want to know a little bit about what you've committed to and how that aligns with the goals that you're describing for the kind of career that you want to pursue. Like a personal statement, the experiences section lets admissions officers understand a little bit more and in a different format about what's important to you. It does present the information in a different way, right? So in this section, we are usually, thinking more about kind of description of specific experiences, being very detailed about a particular kind of experience, whereas a personal statement may have a more kind of global perspective on your candidacy. But these sections are intended to work together, and admissions officers can concentrate on this section. When I worked in admissions, this is where I spent the majority of my time when I was reading an application, trying to get to know a candidate through how they've spent their time. If you've attended one of my previous writing workshops, you will have seen this slide before, but just as a reminder, all of these pieces of writing in the application have to work together to give the full picture of your candidacy. So your personal statement is an overall narrative. It prioritizes demonstrating or sharing your perspective and allowing you to reflect on very large scale important experiences, whereas the work and activity section is much more about presenting information. It helps the reader understand how you've spent the time that you've had to prepare, and it helps to give you a space for very specific details about your activities and accomplishments. Secondary applications, which you'll come to later in the summer, are typically ways to provide context that is relevant to a specific program and allow you maybe to build on information that you've introduced either in your work and activities or personal statement. And interviews can evaluate your communication skills, but they also will touch on a lot of the themes or the information that you have introduced in all of these other written aspects of the application. So keep in mind, right? These things are going hand in hand. And when you're thinking about preparing that primary application, the personal statement and the work and activity section, we want them to work together. We don't want them doing the same thing. We want them supporting the same goal. When you're choosing experiences to list in your application, think about a few things. Number one, how the experiences represent the breadth of your experience, right? So making sure that you're not only emphasizing experiences in kind of one domain of how you've spent your time. You also want to make sure that you're choosing experiences that demonstrate, your capacity for commitment. It's absolutely normal and good and fine for there to be a mix of activities with different levels of commitment, right? There's always ebb and flow. There may be some activities in your application that you did for a period of, a semester, whereas there may be some that you've done for multiple years, right? So having some variation there is totally fine, but I think having at least some experiences that show long-term engagement, that's really helpful for helping a school to understand kind of what your major motivations are, and really how you've been kind of focusing your energies as you've prepared. You also want to think about, what sort of hours per week you have dedicated to any given activity. You're going to be asked to report on either your hours per week or total hours of commitment to the experience, depending on the application service. So thinking about, how, if a person were to sit down and do the math and look at for any given semester, kind of how much time you were spending on building this portfolio, how's that going to look? I talked a little bit before about classifying experiences, and so just for a little bit more detail there, application services do provide you with a preset list of categories, and it's a different list depending on the application service. Some of your activities, and in fact, many of them may fit into more than one category, right? So, for example, you could be a leader within a student organization that does community service. That could fall under non-clinical service, that could fall under extracurriculars, that could fall under leadership, right? I mean, any one of those category labels I think would be absolutely reasonable for an experience like this. So when you're deciding on how you want to categorize the experience, keep in mind that you want to highlight, if you can, through the category choice, what the experience really meant to you or what you gained from it to help you with the classification. So if what you're focusing on is really the leadership role that you had within the organization, then classifying it as a leadership role and writing a little bit more about that can make a lot of sense. If there's a little bit of ambiguity and you feel like genuinely an activity sort of equally fits into two places, you kind of just have to go with your gut and pick one. But again, remember, you're going to have a space to describe these experiences, so you'll be able to make it clear what your responsibilities, what the outcomes of your work were in the description that you write, even if the category label doesn't perfectly encapsulate it. When you're thinking about representing your hours, just be honest and careful, right? There is no requirement for most of these application services that you have like a third-party external documentation of your hours, that you upload pay stubs or evidence of your particular volunteering experiences. But you want to be, as accurate as you possibly can, especially if you're estimating, especially if it's an experience that's not current. And so you're sort of thinking back and reconstructing from the past. The most important thing to keep in mind is that you should never duplicate hours across experiences, right? So if you are sort of talking about two different aspects of an experience and different entries, making sure that you are never repeating the hours across two entries is the most important thing. It is possible that admissions personnel could look to calculate, sort of the hours per week based on the data you provide. That's, I think, something that admissions officers are more tempted to do if you list a very high number of hours in a relatively short period of time, just to sort of have a sanity check on, is this possible given that this person was in school at the same time, et cetera. But admissions personnel are not going to approach these all from like one, sort of single perspective. They won't always be doing the math themselves. Some services do allow you to specify multiple date ranges for any single entry. So for example, in AMCAS, you're going to be able to list up to 4 different date ranges for an entry. This is really great if your involvement in something has been non-continuous or if the hours have changed pretty dramatically over time. So, for example, maybe a summer research experience that you continue that you did over the course of a couple of different summers, but not in the intervening academic year. Really easy to show that. Or, for example, like at the bottom here, if you had a commitment that was a lot higher in hours during the summer and then lower during the regular semester, you could make it clear through the date ranges. Or you can use the description section to clarify that if it's not possible in your application service to have multiple ranges. How many experiences should you be entering? So as I said before, not all services have a maximum. AMCAS does, it's 15. And that's a service that the majority of our applicants are going to be using. I like to encourage people to make sure that, they're applying with at least about 10 to 11 entries. I find that most successful candidates are going to have somewhere between about like 12 and 15, most typically. But I also think that it's better that you list 13 rather than kind of trying to stretch to fill 15 spaces. If you have kind of the opposite problem and you've got too many things that you have to make some decisions about, you can approach this in a lot of different ways. There are no hard and fast rules about how you present the way that you have spent your time, other than you can't duplicate the hours. So if you have activities maybe that are similar, you could group them together instead of breaking them apart in separate entries. So for experience types like shadowing, so often a shadowing experience is a fairly short-term one. You could have just one entry in which you describe all of your shadowing experiences. If you are including experience types like awards, hobbies, those kinds of things, I always encourage not using more than one entry for those and really trying to kind of maximize the space that you have for other things. You can also group related experiences if you would like to do so. So for example, in an entry about your research, you could include information about a presentation that you gave, instead of listing that presentation as a separate activity. If you have the space to list them separately, totally fine to do so. If you have work experiences, sort of non-clinical work experiences, perhaps jobs that you worked as an undergraduate to help support yourself or your family, Please, please include your jobs. It's really important that professional schools have the context, particularly if you're working a significant number of hours a week consistently as a college student, particularly if you have financial obligations beyond yourself. Those kinds of pieces of information can be really helpful for programs to interpret your application overall. They also just value people with the ability to balance a lot of competing demands and people who show a really strong work ethic, and work experiences, really can help you do that. When you're thinking about adding these kinds of experiences, I know sometimes folks are reluctant because they think, oh, this is not so relevant, but relevance to the career field is not your primary concern here. It's really helping the school understand the demands on your time overall. And aside from that, I think that a lot of jobs that folks have that are not, in healthcare itself still help you build skills that are highly relevant to healthcare. So when you're talking about jobs, maybe that don't seem to have a direct connection to your long-term professional goals, think about the transferable skills, right? Think about those core competencies and which of those competencies that job helped you to demonstrate, because that's the way that you're going to get, the attention of a reader. That's the way that you're going to help them to understand, this makes sense. This is a relevant piece of information. And as I said, if you're being clear about the demands on your time, that helps the schools to really contextualize things, right? If you show, for example, that you had a rough semester in sometime during your college experience, but in that semester you were working really hard because there was an extra financial pressure within your family, that's helpful, right? That's helpful for a reader to know, because that helps them understand a little bit more about maybe why your grades look the way that they do. Just one example. There are billions of them out there. Let's see. International experiences. So experiences outside of the US are absolutely valid and may be included. I know that a lot of folks that I've worked with over the course of my career have connections outside the US, right? Family members who are outside the US, or maybe are folks who are born outside the US themselves. It's absolutely fine and reasonable to get experiences in other healthcare systems. You, of course, do want experiences within the US as well. And you want to be careful when talking about experiences in other systems and other kind of economic situations, that you're framing your remarks in the best way possible. If you're talking about an experience as a transformative one, you have to think about how you can actually demonstrate that you transformed, right? What can you show that is different about your subsequent activities, if you are talking about an experience in that way? You should also keep in mind the guidelines that professional organizations have set out for providing patient care abroad when you're describing your responsibilities. So I'll share the slides with everyone. The link here goes to an AAMC document that kind of outlines, sort of what they consider to be appropriate activities for undergraduates. I get lots of questions when people are making decisions about applications about experiences that have some sort of political or sort of controversial valence, such as volunteering at Planned Parenthood, being a part of union organizing, perhaps being part of protests. These kinds of experiences can be included in applications, right? They are to include them is a choice, though, right? And I encourage people, when you're thinking about saying something that you imagine could be controversial to some readers, ask yourself why you want to share that experience, and what you are sharing about it, right? So is it from the perspective of very specific skills that you learned, that you were able to develop through the course of that experience? Is there kind of, what's the reason, and how much detail do you need to make your point? Also, you should think about whether the experience is representative of things that you want to continue doing, right? So, if your goal is to become an abortion provider in the future, that's pretty central to the kind of portfolio that you're presenting as somebody who wants to be a health professional. And so you kind of only would want to go to a program that's going to help give you the training to set you up for a career like that. It's also important to know that, ultimately any experience could elicit a pretty strong response from an application reader, right? Everyone who reads your application, you know, every person has a different set of experiences, a different perspective, and different beliefs about the world, right? And so anything that you include could be something that a person doesn't personally like, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to say no to your application, but if they did, you want to think about whether you'd be happy in a place where work that's important to you is judged negatively, right? Or there's not a space for that kind of work in that institution. Similarly, outing type experiences. So here maybe like eh, affiliation with an organization that gives a clue as to a queer identity or a religious identity or an ethnic identity, right? Things that maybe you're not sharing elsewhere in the application. You want to think about the fact that you're sharing information right there. So, are you talking about that elsewhere in the application? If it's about a queer identity, is that central to your goal as a provider? Is that a part of your motivation? Then it makes a lot of sense to tell as part of your story. If it's not something that you need to tell the story, then it's really much more of a judgment call as to whether that's something you include in the application. Again, I don't think that there's an objective right or wrong answer here. It's most important that you're thinking about potential vulnerabilities and how the inclusion of any given piece of information might affect your application. When it comes to most meaningful experiences, as I said before, there are different rules. So AMCAS, you can do up to 3 experiences. For ADSAS, the dental school application, you can actually note up to 6 of them as most meaningful, which is a lot, although ADSAS doesn't limit the number of experiences you can add. In AMCAS, you get an additional 1,325 characters. So baseline, everybody gets 700 characters, and then you get 700 plus 1325 for each of those most meaningful experiences. So this space is essentially intended to give you room to write a little sort of mini essay about why the experience was important for you. This is a place maybe where you're going to focus on things like telling a story about a particular thing that happened in the course of that experience, or reflecting at some more length about what you learned from an experience, that sort of thing. This is a really great space versus, I think, the personal statement to really elaborate a lot more about specific activities. So this can be really important when you're choosing experiences to note as most meaningful. You want to think about, okay, is there breadth here, right? Am I choosing some experiences that highlight different facets of my portfolio? You may also think, and I'm going to preface this by saying this is not a hard and fast rule by any stretch of the imagination, but if, for example, you have a most meaningful experience that is also associated with a letter of recommendation that is part of your portfolio, that's a great thing. By no means do I mean that you have to have a letter for everything that you note as most meaningful. That is not true. But places where there's overlap are usually good places to think about those most meaningful activities, right? If it's something that you've spent enough time to develop a really strong relationship with someone, it's potentially a place to look for those most meaningfuls. Future experiences are really important to consider. You can only list activities that you have begun at the time of your application submission when you submit. AMCAS will let you estimate future hours. So if you have, for example, a job that you start in May and you submit your application in June, you can include one date range that says the hours that you've already completed between May and June. And then you can include another date range that shows your projected hours from July through the next June, for example. Other application services have different rules. ADIA, ADSAS, and ACOMAS only accept hours that you have completed. However, Both of those application services allow for updates, so you can include new entries later after your application is verified. You can't do that in AMCAS. If you are listing an experience where maybe you've only just started it and a lot of your responsibilities are going to come during the application year, you should use the description space to clarify, what you expect your duties to be, why you're excited about the experience, etc. And then as you submit secondary applications, if you're applying to programs that require those, providing details about ongoing experiences there, potentially sending updates individually to schools in the future if there's sort of significant stuff coming out of those experiences that kind of weren't done at the time you applied. Those are all possibilities as well. Okay, that's a lot to kind of keep in mind. I'm going to talk you through really briefly a strategy that I like to employ for just kind of thinking about how to get started, right? I'm not saying the final version of your descriptions is going to look exactly like this every time, but I'll talk through kind of how you can begin and ways to refine your writing about these experiences. So first things first, I like to use something like the STAR method, which, if you've talked to anyone at Beyond Barnard about resume writing, we usually employ when it comes to things like writing bullets for your resume. So here we're doing something slightly different. We're writing in prose, but we're trying to accomplish the same thing, right? We're trying to communicate the important information as is relevant to the reader of this particular application. So the STAR method focuses on providing four particular kinds of information: situation, so allowing the reader to understand kind of the context that this activity was happening in; task, meaning kind of what are your major responsibilities; action, this is the most important part, what did you do as a result of your situation and the tasks you were assigned; and then result, which is about as important as action as well, what came of that, right? I encourage applicants to health professions programs to focus on achievements and outcomes rather than spending too much time on the tasks, right? So you want to make sure that the reader has enough to understand kind of like what you were supposed to be doing, but you also want to focus more on what you actually did. So tying the results to particular goals of the organization or the group that you're working with, or your own personal goals if it's an individual activity, all of those things are great. So there's an example here that kind of provides a sort of, I think, this is an example of this structure. So talking about what you were doing, you're a research assistant in this lab, you designed and implemented experiments. The goal was testing adults' ability to acquire new speech sound contrasts. Then we get to what I did, recruiting a particular number of participants, surpassing the goal of the research. I did the testing, analyzed results, and now an outcome is a publication in the Journal of Memory and Language, right? So a basic structure like this, I think, is a really good way to start most of your activity descriptions. You can tweak it. You can kind of, increase, decrease aspects of it based on the character count that you have to work with. But this is a really good baseline for beginning your descriptions. I encourage applicants not to rely too much on adjectives. Using quantification where you can is really helpful, but you don't want to be, describing your research as groundbreaking. You want to be trying to express the groundbreakingness of it through facts. It's also important not to exaggerate, right? There's no pressure to do that. Your contributions to research as an undergraduate or a recent college graduate are not expected to be the same as if you were doing a PhD or if you were a PI in a lab. So being clear and honest about your contribution to the work, and finding the right level of detail. This is usually the piece of the puzzle that takes the most time. Thinking about, what do you need to communicate the meaning of this experience? What is most relevant for the reader to know. This means that you're not necessarily going to be able to say everything. You're not going to be able to be exhaustive about most of your experiences. So, if you're talking about a research experience, for example, it may not be that you focus on things like specific lab techniques, right? I don't need to know so much about like, how to do PCR analysis. I need to know, more about kind of like what was the goal of your research, and what did you contribute to that project? And just as with any piece of writing, but also especially the personal statement, revising your descriptions is really key. You want to pay attention to the same things that we talked about with respect to the personal statement. Content, structure, tone, that's all still important here, right? This is still writing. This is still a way for you to express your perspective to the reader. It's important to be consistent with punctuation. I really strongly advocate for writing prose, like writing a short paragraph rather than using bullets. I think that it shows a lot more effort on the part of the applicant, and it's definitely more common. And I think it's a really good exercise for you to be able to write about these things in prose as a way of preparing yourself for talking about them in, non-bullet point language, if you get an interview. When you think about, what exactly you do want to highlight about these experiences, I want you to always consider how those experiences form a part of the narrative that you want to convey to schools, right? If we're talking about an activity that you've done, maybe because, so let's say you have been a Portuguese tutor for the past 3 years. You really want to work with a Portuguese speaking patient population. You're interested in kind of the use of the language, et cetera. Or maybe you've been an ESL tutor for people who come into the US from Portuguese speaking countries, whatever. You want to be able to show like, hey, there's a connection here, right? I've been spending my time, I've been using the abilities that I have now to do the kinds of things that I want to do in the future in kind of a more specialized way as a healthcare professional. You also want to make sure that you're using the space to provide context for programs to understand your choices. So this can go back to things like your work experience, right? If talking about your work experience helps a school understand the circumstances under which your application developed, that's a really good thing, right? Because that allows them to interpret your application holistically in potentially a different way than they would if they didn't know that information. So I'm gonna talk us through a couple of examples here. I'm going to show you some examples on the screen. We won't do a ton of these. I think we'll just do 2 or 3, but I'll share the slides with everyone so you can see all of them. In each of these examples, which I've adapted from previous applications, names and other identifying details have all been changed. So what I'd like to ask you all to do is to read and just kind of note any assessments that you have in terms of strengths of a particular entry, as well as maybe questions that you have about that entry or potential weaknesses, right? So I'm going to give you a second to read, and then I'll just ask, you can pop in the chat if you have any thoughts. So first example here, I'm going to mute for a second, give you a chance to read, and then we'll come back. Okay. Any thoughts about this entry or questions that you have after reading it?
It seems pretty strong to me. I think that they did a good job of explaining the purpose of their work and the impact of the work. Yeah,
I
pretty good.
definitely agree. Thank you, Lucy. Um, sorry, I went the wrong way. I like that the language is accessible to non-specialists, especially. That's always, if you give me an entry of yours to critique and it's about research, the first thing that I'm going to point out is if the language is not approachable to a non-specialist, that's a problem. I think they did a great job of connecting the experience to future interests, and it's a full academic year commitment with pretty substantial hours for something during the regular semester. The question that a reader could potentially ask is that, hey, this isn't a most meaningful activity, so is research a priority for the student? That question could be answered by looking at the rest of the entries. We don't have the rest of the entries here, but that's something that a reader could be asking themselves. Let's do one more, and um, I'll pause here and let you read this one, which I know is a little longer. Sorry. Okay, any thoughts about this entry? Okay, well, oh, Christy, do you want to
Yeah.
say something?
Yeah, I think I was just gonna say how I guess in the beginning when they were explaining the most meaningful experience remarks, that they didn't have to explain it again, that it was one of the most valuable medical experiences in their 4 years, as they already say, like putting, I guess, like in the part of the application, so they could have used that space to write more about the type of work they did there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't even know if I point that out. And here, I'll show you what I said. So, I liked that there's good quantification in this example, right? Talking about how many patients were enrolled and the kinds of measures that the study was using to sort of provide a really robust understanding of the work that the person was doing. Um, it is listed as the most meaningful activity, but it's a pretty short commitment. So again, there's a question there. How does this compare to the other most meaningful activities in the application? Are they all shorter term, or is there some variation? Are there other longer term experiences? And this one, even though it was short term, was really exceptional. I do think the most meaningful marks, yeah, they meander a little bit, right? So Christy, as you pointed out, you don't have to sort of restate the proposition that your experience was meaningful, because that's why you're even writing this part of it. Focusing a little bit more on the experience and the details, sort of to help the reader understand it a little bit better. Okay, so I'm just gonna blast through some of the rest of these. As I said, I'll share the slides so you can get a sense, and you can, play the game yourselves, read, and then you can look at my comments on the second slide for each one. Okay, I'm gonna take us through a few last thoughts, and then I'll open it up for questions. Um, I think a lot of times people are concerned with their applications, sort of standing out among the pack. I understand why that is. I really strongly believe that the best way you can do that is to very clearly describe the impact your experiences have had on you. You do not have to have experiences that themselves are completely and fundamentally different from the experiences of other candidates in order to present something unique in your application. If you are writing very sincerely and and thoughtfully in your descriptions of your experiences in your personal statement, those are things that really do help you stand out to admissions personnel because nobody else has had your experiences from your perspective, right? Many other candidates will have had research experiences. People may have even done research that is, in domains really similar to yours. But your experience of that work and what that work has meant to you is individual. It is a unique piece of your application. And ideally, these experiences should help you to tell a story to admissions personnel, right? This is again, it's part of the difference between doing something and pulling the meaning of that thing out in order to highlight it for the reader, right? So you want to make sure that when you're writing about experiences, you are sharing with the reader what you care about. You're helping them to understand the priorities that you have as a person and, potentially as a professional. You're trying to help them understand how you have developed the skills and competencies that they need in order for you to be trainable as a student in their school. Some other tips: always take care with the technical language, particularly with your research, please. Not all readers are going to be specialists, right? Your readers are going to be educated people. They're going to be smart people. They're going to be people with a lot of different experiences. But your application could be read by a physician or a non-physician. And even if it is read by a physician, they may not be a specialist in any way in the kind of work that you've done. So making sure that for anything, if it's clinical, if it's research, if it's a work experience, you are presenting it in a way that's accessible to someone who's not in that field is incredibly important. You can definitely talk about patients if you have, for example, clinical experiences, or you can talk about, people that you've worked with in the course of service experiences. Often these kinds of stories come up in the context of writing those most meaningful reflections. It's totally fine to talk about interactions that you've had with people, but just make sure that you de-identify them, right? A pseudonym, use only initials, make up the initials, and think about what you're including, right? You should only share the information that you need to make your point. You don't want to include any kind of extra just sort of gory details about a person's condition that are extraneous to the point you're trying to make. And you want to be really careful and potentially have somebody else read for the tone that you're using to describe that person. You want to make sure that you're not using language that could be perceived as condescending or judgmental in any way. You want to make sure, especially if you're writing about somebody who is coming from circumstances that are really materially different from your own, that you're showing that you can approach those interactions with humility and that you can appreciate that people's circumstances really can very much affect their choices and their decision making. If you're writing about a negative experience, try to present it in a solution-oriented way, right? Not focusing on the negative, but focusing maybe instead on actions that you took to help improve a situation, or ways that the experience has motivated you to to work to better those circumstances in your professional career. And always remember not to overgeneralize. Having one experience, particularly in, say, a clinical setting, is not indicative of the experience you would have in any single clinical setting. So making sure that you're keeping in mind you're at the beginning of your career. You still have a lot to learn. So scaling your comments such that you're always focusing on presenting your perspective and not kind of making broad pronouncements globally. That's it. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and open it up for folks to ask questions if you have any. There was one that was put in the chat while I was speaking. So if you want to add one to the chat, I'm going to answer this one first. So the question is about including hours completed before college. This is it's a really good question. Again, there's not a hard and fast rule about when your experiences start. I generally encourage people to include experiences that happen after high school graduation. So if you didn't come straight to college, you could potentially include things like, gap year activities. Um, but I usually encourage people not to include high school activities unless there is something really important about it, So, for example, you started a business or a nonprofit organization, during high school, but it's something you've continued since then, certainly that could be something that you include in an application. Or if it's an experience that was really like particularly formative to you, again, you can use your judgment, but I think you really do want to prioritize including experiences that have happened since you graduated from college, from high school, sorry. Christy had a question about how to approach listing hobbies. I think that it's totally fine to use hobbies. That's a category in these application services. So certainly writing about a hobby or two can be a way for schools to kind of just get to know a little bit more about the person you are. I would say it's important to choose hobbies that help to illustrate things about you that you would like people to know in a professional context, and to think about what you can say about those activities that will be helpful to the reader, right? So if it's an activity that has helped you like really improve your attention to detail, or your in the context of dental applicants, right? Your manual dexterity, you're somebody who does really like fine needlepoint or something of that nature. That can be really helpful for the school to understand because those are qualities that they're looking for. In the same vein, if your hobby is like maybe it's an arts related thing and you're applying to medical school, thinking about how your hobbies have helped you, like as far as your perseverance, your ability to stick with something over a long period of time, all that sort of stuff is really possible. And again, you have a lot of control over exactly how you present them. Next question is whether it's okay to include hours that overlap with a class. For example, if you're volunteering or doing research associated with course credit, yes, you should just make sure that you're only including the hours that you were actually volunteering or actually in the lab versus hours that you spent in class. There's another question about whether you can use this space to describe significant family responsibilities, like caring for a family member. Yes, absolutely. People do use these experience spaces for things like caretaking, particularly if you're a primary caretaker for someone who is sick or disabled over a long period of time. It can be really very helpful for a reader to know about a commitment like that. Liliette, you have a question?
Hi, yes. One of my questions that is about when you were talking about contributions in an opportunity and how you contributed to a project.
Mhm.
Would it be safe to say that you can also talk about if a project is currently in review for publication or a poster, even if you're not the person who is first author, for instance?
Yeah. I mean, you definitely could. You could include that, right? The results of this work are in review for publication, or something of that nature. Definitely. It's very much up to you to decide kind of what you want to highlight for the reader.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Um, so for the most meaningful experiences, um, there really is a lot of room to maybe perhaps tell an anecdote.
Yeah.
Is that normal? Because I just think that it could be kind of dry if it was pure like listing tasks and
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It's very common for people to use that extra reflection space to like tell a story associated or to think more about sort of overall like how you want the reader to interpret this activity versus just focusing on the description. So you'll still have that space for the description and you should approach that just like any other entry. Then you just get the extra space where, yeah, you could tell a story about a significant interpersonal interaction or like an overcoming of adversity in the research experience, right? Things didn't work out and how you got over that or something of that nature. That's a great thing to be able to include.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right, well, I wish everybody luck as you are, using the materials you've submitted with committee applications to kind of keep moving these descriptions forward. You're welcome to reach out if you would like feedback on experiences because these sections are pretty long. I can't review all of them for everyone. So I'll just ask that if you'd like comments, you pick your top 3 and send those to me as an attachment, and I can give you some thoughts. And again, if you send me things about your research and there are a lot of acronyms and a lot of words that I don't know, that's the first thing I'm going to tell you to change. So, so you can do that now. All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone being here for this session as always. Folks who are on the mailing list, you'll get a message shortly with the slides and everything. I'll also send you the link to register for my last spring event, which is going to be in April. We're going to be talking about the logistics of the application process. It is details city in that session. So if you are a details person and you want to know how these next steps are going to work, that will be the session for you. Thanks everyone so much. Have a great rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you.